Start the recording. Lovely. Welcome if you're joining us on the recording. Hello and welcome everyone to the very first session of our first online version of the Research with International Students Conference. My name is Jenna Mittelmeier and I'm joined by my colleague Sylvie Lomer, and we're both the co-conveners of this RIS network. If it's your first ever session with us, then welcome. We're a friendly group and a network of hundreds of researchers and scholars around the world whose work focuses on international students, and we include international students as participants or co-researchers within our work. We've been really looking forward to the online conference this week and to the packed schedule of genuinely really amazing speakers and topics that we have planned throughout the week. So we hope that you're able to join us for sessions throughout the week as you're available. I also just want to reiterate that we'll be using a Padlet throughout the conference, so you can add any stray thoughts or ideas as we go along throughout the week. This is intended to be a space for brainstorming the notion of purpose, which is the focus of this conference and the focus of this starting session. I've added the link to the chat already, so please do use that liberally as thoughts come into your head. The other thing I wanted to say is we have a very slight change to today's schedule for the second session just after this. Unfortunately, the speaker, Vera Spengler, is unwell today and so can't present. So instead, we're going to make this present session just a little bit longer, giving us some extra discussion time at the end, taking us to 8:45 UK time, and then we'll have a slightly longer break leading into Yunue's presentation, which starts at 9 o'clock or the top of the hour, wherever you happen to be in the world. So for this very first session, we wanted to start the conference with a bit of insight into how Sylvie and I chose the conference theme of finding purpose, and to provide perhaps some provocative prompts for shaping our discussions as we move throughout the week. So I'll hand over to Sylvie to kick us off.
Thanks, Jenna, and welcome everyone. So we wanted to start off with a big question of why are we still researching with international students? Jenna and I have now been working in this space for about 10 years, and the field as a whole is arguably, 20 to 30-ish years old. If we look at the time when research with international students really kicked off and started to intensify. And so this seems like a really useful moment to pause and to ask, well, what have we accomplished and what remains to add? We do have really significant evidence bases on a number of the sort of most popular themes and topics for framing research with international students, particularly around experiences or challenges, as they are often framed, of international students, both in their study destination and on return home. And we have a lot of evidence as well on how identity changes during international study. We also have a lot of evidence about the motivations, or as they're sometimes called, determinants of international study, so why students want to study abroad. And yet we still see these studies being published over and over again, often in very small scale case studies that take fundamentally quite exploratory approaches to this research. And in many cases, even where those studies are in and of themselves quite well defined and well conducted, it's hard to see what they're adding to the wider literature, even where they're framing questions around changes in technology or specific changes to the context, such as during COVID-19. So I think this is where we want to situate the presentations for this conference, is in looking for reflections on the entirety of what has been accomplished over the last 20 to 30 years and framing more significant contributions to the field. Over to you, Jenna.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the reasons why we started this network and one of the reasons why we wanted to publish our Research with International Students book last year is to dismantle the presence of prevalent deficit models when it comes to research with international students, and subsequently to practices within higher education with international students, where research overwhelmingly portrays international students as only experiencing challenges or sees them as lacking various skills expected for success. So throughout Sylvie and I's work in recent years, we've identified across our various projects and across analyses of existing literature that this is a really dominant narrative within our research field, where so many studies begin from the position of wanting to fix international students um, or find answers for their perceived deficiencies. Um, and a lot of research that's positioned around challenges in international classrooms. It's something that's really pervasively entrenched and persistent across our subfield of research. And in our work and in a growing number of scholars' work, we've written a lot about how these narratives are actively harmful and how they position international students as inferior students, perpetuating stereotypes about them. I don't want to reiterate our key concern about these deficit narratives here, because I think probably those that are in the room recognize this challenge within our field. But also, if this is a new concept to you, our RIS website is full of compiled literature that questions these persistent deficit narratives. But I think what often gets ignored is how this deficit framing mirrors and even contributes to wider societal narratives, which render migrant groups generally as quote unquote unintegrated or limited in skills, or in some contexts, even dangerous. We see anti-migrant narratives on the rise in many contexts through the growth of far right and right-wing politics, which I'll speak more to about in a second. A dominant narrative in the United States, where I'm originally from, is actively constructing migrants as criminals. The UK, where I'm now based, isn't that far behind, to be honest, as the British Labour government leans into the kind of so-called hostile environment narrative as a means of appeasing right-wing political parties. And these narratives are probably building in so many of your own contexts, wherever you might be based, as well as we see global examples coming to the fore all over the world. And for me, this creates a mission for those of us who work in this area and are opposed to these discourses about migrants generally and about international students specifically, to ask the question, how do we make sure that our research and our work isn't legitimizing these problematic narratives? How are we actively deconstructing deficit framings in our field and the practices that are happening in our field? And maybe most importantly, how are we connecting that with our wider societies? And I think it's easy, especially in these spaces where most people are bringing in critical lenses into their work, it's easy to kind of feel the subfield is shifting and changing towards more critical views, and it is. But I think in organizing this network, we spend a lot of time engaging with the literature and with compiling newly published work. And I have to say, every single week there are publications in major journals in our field which are made about international students that are still steeped in really harmful deficits. So we wanted to bring forward the question of what more can we do? How do we actually make a lasting and permanent shift in our narratives about international students, not just within this network, but how do we move this conversation beyond this conference? How do we make anti-deficit views about international students a mainstream view? And I think building on that, the kind of elephant in the room, which I've already alluded to, is recognizing that our work is inherently political. There is no such thing as politically neutral international student mobility, and there's no way to do work in this area without engaging in the politics that underpin this practice. And even those who are within our field who try to claim that they are being apolitical, the choice to portray oneself and one's work as not political is itself a very political statement. I think it's probably on all of our minds that the world is becoming increasingly polarized and increasingly a dangerous place. We've been watching in real time the destruction of entire populations through genocide in places like Gaza, Sudan, and Congo. People's knowledges are being erased as we speak, where in places like Gaza, there are no universities left to be holding the discussions like we have the privilege of doing so this week. And further afield, war, violence, the threat of conflict, it reaches all of our continents and it fills our news every day. We see the rise of far right politics, the rise of ultra nationalism and authoritarianism throughout the world. The United States is one place where this has been dominated within our news cycle in recent weeks, but far right politics lurk in many of our countries, introducing a new a new era of anti-cosmopolitanism, anti-globalization, anti-migration, certainly. So I think the burden of what we see around us is really heavy in all of our hearts. And I think all of us here today have significant worries for the future of our societies and of our world. But something I don't see as explicitly in our work with international students is how our research is connected with these issues. Most obviously, it's because international students come from everywhere in the world and their experiences are shaped by the violence and conflict that they leave and the ones they encounter in their new homes. Changing anti-migrant discourses, laws, visa policies, these are all having lasting impacts on the lives of international students, particularly as they're increasingly encountering more hostile host environments and more restrictions on their mobilities. A number of countries are increasingly weaponizing international students' precarious visa statuses as a means of silencing their political views, for example. And politics are shaping the extent to which we're able to conduct the work that we do. There are places in the world where I would feel a lot less comfortable making this statement, including in my home country. So the politics of policing academic speech is pressing, particularly for those of us who are taking a critical lens. So I think what I mean by saying all that is that politics matter. It matters to the people who we include in our research, and politics matter in our ability to do our research. So I think in the face of all this, how do we make sure our work is not too small scale? How do we make sure that our work is actively contributing to the deconstruction of anti-migrant policies and beliefs? And how do we ensure that our work is actually making a change, not just within higher education, but generally within society? Back to Sylvie.
And I think that one of the ways we can do that is by thinking a little bit more broadly about international students as being an instance or an indicator or maybe one of the most visible symbols of international higher education, and whether we can work out a way to defend international education's broader sociological, but also ideological and political purpose. And as Jenna says, not shying away from the intensely political nature of that narrative. Um, when we're talking about the anti-cosmopolitan narratives of the far right, it's this idea that by sharing in an idea of globalism, an idea of being a global citizen, that we're losing some kind of nationalist connection to our country, to our local environments, to our communities. And I think that it's really important to push back against this and to say that international higher education as a cosmopolitan agenda is actually incredibly important, not just for, it sounds grandiose now, but as part of the post-World War II settlement in, at least in Western Europe and between the US and Europe, it was a part of the idea that we would build a sustained and lasting global peace. That we would establish through cultural exchange, that by studying overseas, you develop empathy and an understanding of the other. You understand that a foreigner is also your potential friend, has a great deal in common with you. These things sound idealistic and they sound kind of luxurious or indulgent when we're talking about the context of violence that Jenna just outlined. but they're also essential. They're essential to our survival as a species and to our ability to live on a habitable planet and to work together collaboratively across borders to try to build a different world order. And it seems to me that in a lot of the research with international students, we are, in some senses, capitulating to the neoliberalist narratives. We're conducting research, for example, on graduate employability of international students, which is important. It's a significant motivation, a rationale, and we know this, we understand this. But if we justify international higher education solely, for example, on its employability potential, we're missing a huge political, social, ideological dimension of international higher education, which is fundamentally to understand the other in the world and to be able to relate to them on a human level. So perhaps I should say that it's not so much the cosmopolitan agenda as a humanistic agenda for international higher education. I've talked myself out of one of my bullet points already, which I think is indicative of the kind of conversations we're hoping from this conference to try to think through together what some of these issues and different framings might be. Because it's true that a lot of the framings and a lot of the instances of international student mobility are potentially elitist, and marketization still has allowed access and expansion. We need a concrete ideological goal to organize around and to voice through our research in order to engage politically against the increasing polarization of our political and social environments. So whether you think that a humanistic framing might be appropriate or whether you have some other ideas, these are things we're really hoping can come out of the conference, and to use Jenna's challenge about making sure our research is not too small scale, to think the scale doesn't have to be in our methodologies or in our research design. The scale can be in whether we're talking about the ideologies and the eventual outcomes that we hope from the systems that we're investigating, the systems like international higher education. Back to you, Jenna.
Well, I think that brings us to the notion of finding purpose. So I think we wanted to bring the theme of finding purpose to recognize that our field is at a crossroads, our world is at a crossroads, but subsequently so is our field, and that we need to kind of desperately identify our purpose if we are to have any chance of contributing to a better world. And the challenge, I think, as Sylvie said at the start, is that we are a research field that's preoccupied with the documentation of experiences. And to put it really bluntly, we don't need more studies that identify that international students face challenges in their experiences. It's been done over and over again. The findings are starting to get very repetitive. Um, and we know already that they have complex motivations for international study. We know that there is nuanced identity reformations that occur as a result of student mobility. And I think we've known for, 20 to 30 years that international study is difficult. We know that there are structural barriers that make that experience even more difficult, which exacerbate encounters with bias, racism, xenophobia, stereotyping, and the like. So I think the question now becomes, how do we move away from documenting this towards doing something about it? So I think the query that we raise is, what does the next 20 to 30 years need to do in order to sustain international student mobility and internationalization more widely as viable, legitimate sociopolitical endeavors? How do we how do we stop the cycle of repetitive research findings and break new ground? How do we actually keep being innovative, but also maybe the question of what is the purpose of our innovation? And maybe even more importantly, how does our research do something? I think a lot of us see the world at the moment and we're thinking, what can we do? And I think that question needs to be brought back into the research that we do within our subfield. So, how do we contribute to developing evidence-based practices that address the problems that we repeatedly find in students' experiences? How do we take the 20 to 30 years of knowledge we already have and start to work towards making a change. So I think that's where we wanted to open up the question and discussion. So those of you that are here today, we'd really like to hear your views. What do you feel is the purpose, if we keep that theme, what's the purpose of research with international students? And I think we have this really wonderful opportunity this week to focus on purpose building within our community. So maybe also thinking about what would you like to share for the group to take forward for the rest of the conference. We'll give you a moment to think through your thoughts, but hope you will contribute to the group discussion about where we might go from here.
So colleagues,